Thank you very, very much. Why would I not say yes to an invitation to Barcelona and to FoCAP? It's wonderful to be back here in Barcelona, and I want first of all to congratulate FoCAP on its 10th anniversary and for all the wonderful work that you have clearly done. And whether I can tell you anything you don't already know, we will see. So, today I want to concentrate on two aspects of primary care. Is it working? Firstly, its relationship-based nature, and secondly, its political context. This is primary care. It is a healthcare delivered within an intimate relationship between two unique individuals, which is underpinned by mutual trust and mutual respect. Clinicians are educated in biomedical science and have a responsibility to make the benefit of scientific advances available to their patients. But most clinicians and almost all primary care physicians are not themselves biomedical scientists. They have a different responsibility, which is to attempt to relieve distress and suffering, and to this end, to enable the sick to benefit from biomedical science while protecting people from its harms. Each patient is unique in terms of their values, aspirations, and life context, but even more fundamentally, each life's history and experience alters the way the body works through a multiplicity of mechanisms, which include effects on the functioning of the nervous and endocrine systems, and epigenetic effects on gene function. These processes have the greatest effects in response to early life experience, and they serve to accelerate or decelerate the natural aging of body cells. Socioeconomic inequality and the directly consequent unequal distribution of hope and opportunity in our increasingly unequal societies play out in premature disease and death for those on the losing side. Barbara Starfield argued that these factors underpin the effectiveness of primary care services. First contact access for each new need, long-term person, not disease-focused care, comprehensive care for most health needs, and coordination of care when it must be sought elsewhere. As Portugal's magnificent poet and doctor knew so well, clinicians need to be able to see and hear each successive patient in the fullness of their humanity, to minimize fear, to locate hope, however limited, to explain symptoms and diagnoses in language that makes sense to each different patient, to witness courage and endurance, and to accompany suffering. So this is Miguel Torga. The one moment in the exercise of my profession that has always fascinated me is the history. The recitation of his woes the patient makes in response to the doctor's inquisitive cordiality. That is the great human moment of the medical transaction. The moment when abysses open or fail to, when truth comes to the surface or fails to, when distress and pity encounter each other or fail to. And as far as I am aware, there is no biomedical evidence that helps with any of this. Yet it seems to be the quality of the relationship between patient and professional that makes primary care work, and it certainly works. Among the medical care variables, primary care is by far the most significant variable related to better health status, correlating with lower overall mortality, lower death rates due to diseases of the heart and cancer, longer life expectancy, lower neonatal death rate, and lower low birth weight. In contrast, the number of specialty physicians is positively and significantly related to total mortality, deaths due to heart diseases and cancers, shorter life expectancy, higher neonatal mortality, and higher low birth weight. Contemporaneous and time-lagged primary care physician to population ratios were significantly associated with lower all-cause mortality, whereas specialty care measures were associated with higher mortality. Barbara Starfield's team estimated that an increase of one family medicine physician per 10,000 persons was associated with a decrease of about 70 deaths per 100,000 people, while an increase of one specialty physician per 10,000 population was associated with approximately 15 additional deaths per 100,000. In February this year, the Starfield analysis was updated in this paper across a number of analytic approaches. Greater primary care physician supply was associated with improved mortality outcomes. The decrease in primary care physician supply across US counties from 2005 to 2015 may have important population health implications. Data from 3,142 US counties, 7,144 primary care service areas, and 306 hospital referral regions were used to investigate the association of primary care physician supply with changes in life expectancy and cause-specific mortality after adjustment for healthcare, demographic, socioeconomic, and behavioural covariates. It seems quite remarkable that this sort of evidence is now 25 years old, and yet there has been vanishingly little effort by governments around the world to strengthen their primary care services. And this is Barbara Starfield's view. The beneficial effects of primary care on mortality and morbidity can be attributed, at least in part, to the focus of primary care on the person rather than on the management of particular diseases. As the rising tide of overdiagnosis so clearly shows, contemporary medical care brings dangers as well as benefits. And when they are not undermined by ill-advised financial incentives, primary care physicians are trained to ensure that only those likely to benefit from specialist care are exposed to it. Beyond that, primary care physicians offer continuing relationships with individual patients and families, which allow therapeutic interaction to extend over time in a context of trust and solidarity. In hospitals, the diseases stay and the people come and go, and in general practice, the people stay and the diseases come and go. Specialist physicians and surgeons focus their knowledge and skills on particular pathologies, a process which has led to enormous technical advances. But generalists remain close to their patients and communities, and are able to observe the generation and progression of illness and disease within particular life contexts and stories. They see disease affecting a succession of unique individuals and come to understand the extent to which individuality modulates disease, so that no two individuals ever experience either illness or disease in exactly the same way. Specialists and general practitioners are inextricably dependent on each other's skills, and it's crucial that both parties remain aware of the extent of this interdependency. General practitioners can only work safely to the limits of their knowledge and skill if they can refer easily and promptly to their specialist colleagues when those limits are reached. Specialists can only use their skills maximally if they are enabled to work with a highly selected population for whom their particular skills are appropriate. There is an almost perfect complementarity between the two parts of the profession, and the interface between general practitioner and specialist care needs to be seen primarily as a means of extending the effectiveness of both. I just wish more politicians and policymakers actually understood that complementarity. This ancient table from a textbook of epidemiology explains why. It shows the extent to which the predictive value of any biomedical test is dependent on the prevalence of the given condition in the population that is tested. The higher the prevalence, as in specialist practice, the greater the predictive value. Look at that, 96.1. The lower the prevalence, as in primary care, the lower the predictive value. Biomedical science is proportionately less robust in an unselected population with low prevalence of serious disease. The miracle is that with a predictive value of only 9 for almost every single test that you can think of, we get it right in primary care so often, not that we sometimes get it wrong. One of the principal achievements from the point of view of the specialists, our principal achievements is to provide very broadly based diagnostic skills which can select through the referral process a high prevalence populations for specialist practice and thereby ensure the effectiveness of specialists. One just wishes that in some contexts they appreciated our offering a little bit more than they sometimes seem to. This surely must be one of the foundations of Starfield's finding of much better health outcomes in healthcare systems which have strong primary care provision. Because specialists have no idea how to cope with this sort of level of predictive value. So illness is what you have on your way to see the doctor. Disease is what you have on the way home. And illness is much, much more extensive than disease. All the symptoms people feel, much more expensive. And the disease which is referred on to specialist colleagues, this little red box here, is only just over a tenth of that seen and treated in general practice. And at each stage, from illness to the disease that specialists see, the prevalence of biomedical abnormality increases and diagnostic tests work more robustly. Now, the trajectory of the patient, however good their medical care, will always eventually end in death. And here again, the experience of specialists and general practitioners diverges. When back in 2011 I despaired of the prevailing talk of an epidemic of non-communicable disease and asked what we wanted to die from and whether we would prefer to go back to dying in accidents or from infections, I received this very wise response from a specialist who wrote, "We as consumers and providers of healthcare know all too well about the certainty of death. We pretend and lead our lives trying to ignore this inevitability, and it is becoming easier to do so. We concentrate on one cause of morbidity, devise dubious early diagnoses, tout treatments focusing on proxy measures, and set aside competing comorbidities. We have come to believe, either sincerely or otherwise, that death from causes outside of our own specialty is tantamount to success and mission accomplishment. We know better, but the material rewards are generous for ignoring the whole human condition, diverting attention towards minor gains is rather enriching. So a death from a non-cardiac cause can be regarded as a triumph for a cardiologist. But all deaths fall within the remit of primary care. Both specialists and generalists need perhaps to look more honestly at the effects of these postures of denial on those we care for and on society more generally. Most policymakers seem to have little understanding of the importance of personal relationships in healthcare, between professionals with different skills and between professional and patient. Specialists and general practitioners have much to learn from each other, and this potential for mutual education for the benefit of all is proportionately more powerful the more it is linked to the care of particular patients, because so much depends on the life context of the patient. Depends on the nature of the patient's home. Many specialists never have the extraordinary privilege of being invited into a patient's home, and their experience is inevitably the poorer for it. And so much depends upon the family relationships that that home contains. Genuinely personal care, integrated around the hopes, values and context of the particular patient, requires authentic dialogue and real sharing of power between doctor and patient. The essential feature of genuine dialogue between parties, both of whom have power and autonomy, including that between doctor and patient, is that neither party controls the interaction and both can be changed by it. Remember that this is the very opposite of an encounter whose purpose is to achieve compliance, horrible word, or meet targets. If a doctor or other clinician perceives their role simply as a purveyor of information, he or she has no capacity for change, and there is no real dialogue. Worries about medical paternalism have meant that young doctors may now be taught sometimes and in some places to provide information to patients and to offer them choices, but to avoid advice as to which course of action might be preferable. Yet some of the treatment choices that patients are asked to make are almost horrifyingly serious and can have very far-reaching consequences. Is it fair to expect patients to shoulder the full responsibility for these choices entirely alone, especially when their autonomy is already compromised by anxiety, pain, or sickness? Trust is essential to establishing any relationship between human beings, and the fiduciary relationship between patient and doctor necessitates additional dimensions of trust. The patient must feel able to trust that the doctor has the necessary and appropriate training and skill, and that he or she is functioning within an ethical framework which prioritizes the needs of the patient above those of the doctor. Which brings me directly to my second topic, the political context of primary care in the 21st century. Back in 1996, I wrote my first article for the British Medical Journal, but these words were written not by me, but by my brilliant co-author, Per Fugelli, then the Professor of Social Medicine at the University of Oslo. He wrote, "Patients and doctors are actors in a play, written by history, directed by culture, and produced by politics. Over recent years, the producer has become increasingly autocratic, ignoring the experience of the writer, the sensitivity of the director, and the expertise of the actors." And over the intervening 23 years, this seems to me to have become ever more the case. In line with this pastiche of an equation also devised by Per, in which he emphasizes the power of the political influence on health. Health equals biology times individuality times politics squared. In view of this reality, how can healthcare, particularly first contact generalist primary care, be anything other than fundamentally political? We know this. Every day, if we have eyes to see, we see very clearly how the structural violence of social inequality and injustice erodes health. So I want to talk a very little about how the medical industrial complex makes everyone sick, how unequal societies make the poor sicker, the predicament of healthcare professionals, and bridging the gap between practice and politics. The medicalisation of ever more aspects of life is proceeding at breakneck pace. Throughout human history, unscrupulous people have sought to make money out of human illness, and today, perhaps more than ever, we have created a whirligig of greed, fear, wishful thinking, and vested interest, all of which are driving the medicalising of society and the over-medicating of populations. The political and financial power of the pharmaceutical companies continues to grow. They supply money and resources to both practitioners and researchers. At the same time, developments in information technology drive the rigorous standardization of diagnosis and management of illness and disease, so that more and more care is driven by protocols which are supposed to minimize the uncertainties and ambiguities of management. Pharmaceutical companies are actively involved in sponsoring the definitions of diseases and promoting them to both prescribers and consumers. The social construction of illness is being replaced by the corporate construction of disease. Only a minority of most populations is acutely ill at any one time, whereas the majority are healthy and can be persuaded of a need to take action to remain so, to undergo screening, to take preventive medication. There is more money to be made out of selling healthcare interventions for the healthy majority than for the sick minority. And in a global context, more money to be made out of selling remedies for those who are both rich and healthy, rather than those who are both poor and sick. The result is an enormous amount of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, and as a direct result, an enormous amount of waste and harm. The rates of consumption of prescription drugs, particularly in the name of prevention, are increasing at a phenomenal rate. These are the increases over just the first 15 years of this century, and the rates are likely to be even higher by now. Now, Spain's here, lower for antihypertensives than the OECD average, but look at you here with your statins, going completely crazy, but look at us. Though apparently we weren't prescribing any at all before 2000, I think something a bit funny there, but these are huge, huge increases and huge profits for the pharmaceutical industries. The rise of what Peter Skrabanek called risk factorology has been exponential. It is a potent source of fear among both patients and doctors. Every healthcare professional is now required to consider an ever greater array of potential risks to the patient's health, however well that patient might be feeling. And every responsible and rational citizen is expected to actively seek out and eliminate all possible risks to their future health and to consume medical technologies in order to achieve this aim. All around us, we see the transformation of human conditions, capabilities and capacities into opportunities for pharmaceutical intervention. Yeah, makes me want to cry too. Disease used to be regarded as a misfortune, but is now seen as an opportunity for profit. Health was once seen as a blessing, but now it too has become an opportunity for profit. Perhaps the greatest human injustice plays out in the structural violence that dictates differences between the lives of the rich and those of the poor within our deeply and increasingly unequal societies. Not only are the lives of the poor too often scarred by lack of hope and opportunity, but they tend often as a direct result to be both shorter and sicker. The anthropologist Nancy Shepherd-Hughes defines structural violence as violence that is permissible, even encouraged. It refers to the invisible social machinery of inequality that reproduces social relations of exclusion and marginalization via ideologies, stigmas, and dangerous discourses attendant to race, class, sex, and other invidious distinctions. Structural violence naturalizes poverty, sickness, hunger, and premature death, erasing their social and political origins so that they are taken for granted and no one is held accountable except the poor themselves. Every doctor working within societies that are subject to increasing socioeconomic polarization will acknowledge the validity of this definition. We have all seen lives and health destroyed by each of the varieties of this endemic violence, and we are fully aware of its force. Brian Stevenson is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and he knows a thing or two about structural violence. And in this great book, Stevenson writes, "My work with the poor and the incarcerated have persuaded me that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." And when we think about what happens to those patients who find themselves on the losing side of structural violence, we too begin to see that the opposite of sickness and disease may not be health. It may again be justice. And if justice is the issue, then again our work is inevitably political. This amazing musician, Nina Simone, also suffered much in the face of structural violence, and her insight is telling. She said, "I'll tell you what freedom means to me. No fear." And in this recent British novel, Sarah Morris writes, "She has only recently been able to put into the words the observation that people who grew up in households without fear lack awareness of others' feelings, and that this lack makes their lives easier, more sane. We know that poverty all too easily makes families more dangerous. This is data from the UK. The worst fifth of children are 4 times more likely to have a severe mental health condition than the best of. Stress and fear are known to disrupt neurodevelopment. We know this, we see its effects every day. Lives lived in conditions of chronic stress and fear damage minds and bodies. Allostasis is the process by which physiological functions respond to challenge, and it seems to be mediated by multiple neural and endocrine mechanisms. But the body's capacity for allostasis is limited and can be overloaded by continuous and excessive stress. Allostatic overload occurs when the adaptive functioning of the body loses its flexibility and becomes fixed. This is from Michael Marmot's Institute of Health Equity at University College London, and it documents the stark relationship between income deprivation and health, from the most deprived populations on the left to the least deprived on the right, with life expectancy in pale green and disability-free life expectancy in dark green, where the gradient is even more marked. This sort of gradient has been replicated across the world and across conditions, and even along the Jubilee line of the Underground line in London, where each stop travelling east from Westminster represents up to 1 year of male life expectancy lost at birth. As Michael Marmot has repeatedly emphasised, individual, family, community and social contexts are the determinants of health. Now, doctors are both the victims and the perpetrators of the predations of the medical industrial complex, largely because they have colluded with, and in many cases driven, the wider social project of seeking technical solutions to the existential problems posed by distress, suffering, and the finitude of life, and the inevitability of aging, loss, and death, which have beset humanity since the beginning of time. No one took any notice when the wonderful James McCormick, Professor of General Practice in Trinity College, Dublin, wrote almost 40 years ago, "Our patients deserve of us accurate diagnosis and appropriate treatment. But when accurate diagnosis is impossible and appropriate treatment unavailable, we delude both them and ourselves by using diagnostic labels and prescribing specific treatments. When we as general practitioners are in a position to cure illness, cure is usually readily achieved. But cure only signifies postponement of death, it does not confer immortality. No matter how far medical science advances, it can never eradicate human suffering or the fear and fact of death." These are huge and yawning gaps between practice and politics. What can be done and by whom? Paul Farmer writes, "Because of contact with patients, physicians readily appreciate that large-scale social forces, racism, gender inequality, poverty, political violence, and war, and sometimes the very policies that address them, often determine who falls ill and who has access to care. And they most certainly do, and this surely gives us a responsibility to challenge what the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney has described as those arrangements which are offered as truth by powers, window dressers everywhere." My question is, has healthcare become the new opium of the people? Marx is always portrayed as the bearded old man on the left, but he was only 25 and looked like the portrait on the right when he made this famous claim. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. And it was the opium which sedated and placated the oppressed populations of the 19th century, so they did not rebel against intolerable conditions. Today, for the first time in history, we have separated our notions of disease from the human experience of suffering, and have created an epidemic of disease without symptoms, defined only by aberrant biometrics. An ever greater proportion of healthcare resources are directed towards reducing those numbers to some fictitious state of normality, and in the process, those who are perfectly well are not only assigned labels that in themselves can be shown to compromise health, but are also exposed to treatments with significant adverse effects. Yet time and time again, politicians are unable to resist the easy attractions of preventive rhetoric, because if nothing else, it serves to distract attention from government's failure to meet its own responsibilities for health protection through fiscal and legislative measures in terms of promoting greater socioeconomic equity, nurturing vulnerable families, and such policies as minimum pricing for alcohol and plain packaging for cigarettes. Has healthcare, with its mask of humanity and concern, sustained by all those dedicated professionals falling through the gap between patients and politics, yet with its hidden engine of private profit within the medical industrial process? Has healthcare become the new opium which prevents the poor who live in increasingly desperate circumstances from expressing open unrest? Let's think about the rate of increase in antidepressant prescribing over just one decade, and let's discuss it. This is from an editorial in The Lancet by Richard Horton. Science has not eradicated suffering, despite its enormous power to deliver technologies to improve health. Being more humble about the experience of individuals, rather than simply drawing up reductive report cards of their health status, opens up the possibility for a more realistic understanding of what it means to be healthy. The fact is that one cannot be healthy in an unhealthy society. So I want to end, because I'm from Britain, despite Brexit, with the great British playwright Harold Pinter, who would be in despair about the state of Britain where he's still alive, who said this in his acceptance speech for the 2005 Nobel Prize for Literature. He said, "I believe that despite the enormous odds which exist, unflinching, unswerving, fierce intellectual determination as citizens to define the real truth of our lives and our societies is a crucial obligation which devolves upon us all." And I think that this fierce intellectual determination is a central task of primary care. And I think that FoCAP embodies this. Thank you very much. Gracias. Gracias.